Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session today. Today, I have the honor that I never thought I would have as a young PhD candidate working in the subfield of language policy to introduce Professor Spolsky to you. Professor Spolsky was educated at Wellington College and Victoria University and received a PhD in linguistics from the University of Montreal. He's been the head of the English department, Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, and Director of the Language Policy Research Center at Bar-Ilan University, Israel. Professor Spolsky has conducted and published research in language testing, second language learning, applied linguistics, social linguistics, and language policy. He has been president of TESOL, held a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Mellon Fellowship, and has been senior research fellow at the National Foreign Language Center in Washington. Professor Spolsky retired from the Department of English Language and Literature of Bar-Ilan University, where he's currently Professor Emeritus. Today, Professor Spolsky will share his paper, Continued Thoughts on Language Policy, and he shared with us the following excerpt. I first realized that there was a field studying language policy during a time spent in Washington at the National Foreign Language Center. There, in collaboration with Ilana Shohami, who was also there, and with the inspiration of discussions with Richard Lambert, John Trim, Richard Brecht, Ronald Walton, and others, I came up with a three-component model, something we all are familiar with. This argued that language policy could be seen as a combination of practice, ideology, and management. As time went on, I built a more complex model suggesting that policy could be found at various levels, starting with the family, and not just the state and in various domains. This complexity helped account for the common failure of state-level management. In my most recent approach, and I'll also stress the importance of the individual. Professor Spolsky, thank you for being with us today. We look forward to your talk, and the floor is yours.
Okay. First thing is to see if I can share my screen properly. Yeah. That's me. No, I don't want that. I want that. Whoops. There we go. Okay, that's my screen. That's me. Let me just do one more thing. Oh, can I do a full screen? Let's see if it'll work. Yeah. Is that better? Essentially, what I want to do today is to explain how I got into this field and where I'm up to now. My early work was in language learning, language testing, and by the time I got back to Israel in the 1980s, I was starting to think about the field of language policy. Didn't quite know what to call it. Did some early work with Robert Cooper, who was alive and living here then. He was writing a book on language planning and social change. And we used to meet once a week and talk about his ideas of how to deal with it. Later on, we did a study together of the languages of Jerusalem, which involved us in doing studies of the way in which policy developed, so that it wasn't altogether a new idea when I got to start working and slowly moved into this area of language policy. It was in the 90s when I got a fellowship to the National Foreign Language Center that Richard Lambert started telling me that what I was doing was language policy. Lambert was a historian who had got into language and very concerned about the policy behind teaching of languages.
Energy drink ini enggak habis?
Itu kan?
Energy drink.
Energy.
Yes.
And during that time in Washington, during the year I spent there, I had a number of colleagues with whom I would discuss various ideas to do with the work I'd been doing, moving from bilingualism into bilingual education, from bilingual education into the wider field of educational linguistics. And now I was ready to start thinking about specifically language policy. Fortunately, I had a number of colleagues there, Ilana Shohami, with whom I did a great deal of work and with whom I developed the original model. Richard Brecht, who was the co-director of the center and argued very seriously. He was wonderful to argue with. I must admit I argued with Ilana a great deal too. It was very common. What would happen is one day we were talking about some issue and Ilana would say something and I would say, "You're wrong, that can't possibly work." 2 days later, I'd come back and tell her, "You got it, that was right." There were other people around me during that time. John Trim, for instance, was also at the center during half of that year, and he knew more about the teaching of languages in Europe than anybody had ever thought about. And I was already under the influence of Joshua Fishman, who, both Cooper and me, was actually the model, the guru from whom we learned about language and its relationship to the society in which it's used. So during that time in Washington, Ilana and I developed essentially the first model. And when we got back to Israel the following year, we were fortunate enough to have a minister of education who was actually intelligent and interested in language. And we said to him, "Here are we living in a multilingual country. What's the language policy?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. What's the language policy?" We said, "Well, what's the language policy of the Ministry of Education?" He said, "I hadn't thought about it. Why don't you tell me? Write a policy for me." He said, "Well, we as good academics said, give us some money and we'll spend a year thinking about it." And he said, "No, give me the policy first and then I'll give you the money." So we actually did draft something and then got the money and spent a year or two looking at essentially what had gone on, what was the situation, what were the languages used in Israel, what do people think about them, and what would be a reasonable policy. And we came up with one, but it was too idealistic for the ministry to do anything about implementing. However, that was where we came up with our first model of a policy. Now, I need to straighten out a couple of terms. Language policy is the field that studies the nature and the underlying forces that account for the choice of a language variety that decides more or less within a particular social context what language you choose to speak. A language policy, on the other hand, is something written, usually by a government, that sets a law, a regulation, or a custom within the speech community and says what you should do in this particular situation. For example, this being an international meeting, obviously looking around, I'm sure we have many different languages. The fact that I speak in English is simply a custom that seems to have grown up in the academic community. That's the language policy of very many academic fields, and there's good reason for it to work, but on the other hand, there's good reason to argue with it. Now, another important definition which become more important later on, is the distinction between named languages and linguistic repertoires. A named language is not defined linguistically, but it is defined politically. It's a variety recognized and named by the International Standards Organization officially. And officially, they say they choose something to be a language because it's not mutually intelligible with other varieties. And that's what they say. That's not what they do. What they do is recognize any language associated with a flag, more or less. Remember the definition of a language is a dialect with an army and a flag. For example, if one thinks about Yugoslavia, or during the period that Tito maintained Yugoslavia as a unified state, the argument was everybody speaks Serbo-Croatian. The second the state broke up, each of the new states took that same language variety that they'd been speaking and gave it a new name: Serbian, Croatian, Moldavan, even Kosovan, Montenegro. Each one claims to have its own language, and the International Standards Organization accepts that, even though technically there's very minor differences between them. Minor linguistically, but major as far as perception and recognition. In the same way, as I'll mention later on, in Thailand, officially the government assumes everybody speaks Thai, but in fact, it turns out people speak a lot of different varieties of Thai. So that rather than talking about languages, I find it very more useful now to talk about what is called a linguistic repertoire. It's a term originally, I think, used by Gumpert, but now starting to be used more and more. The linguistic items that are known and used by a speaker, whatever their source. In other words, when I'm speaking English in Israel, I use a lot of words that come technically from Hebrew. But that's what Israeli English is like. Israeli English also has a lot of Yiddish words in it, and so on. So a repertoire can be the knowledge of an individual speaker, and that will become particularly important at the end of the talk, or the variety used by a speech community. So the original model was quite straightforward. Language practices, what in fact happens within the community, what people do. This is, I suppose, the real policy. Language beliefs, what people think they should do. The ideology, the value that people assign to the varieties. Again, a good example from Israel is that most speakers of Hebrew know that they're not speaking correct Hebrew. They believe there is such a thing. They know they don't know it. And if you look at, I'll give you an example of that. The numerical system, the writing numbers, is particularly difficult in Hebrew because the gender gets switched. You use a masculine form with a feminine noun when you're writing numbers, and vice versa. My wife worried about that very much when we settled, and she persuaded our son, who was just finishing high school and had learned all the grammar, to write down for her all the correct ways of writing a check so that she would get her numbers right. And when she did that, people would say to him, "Oh, you must be a new settler, because nobody does that anymore." everybody uses the incorrect form. Okay, so that's belief. And language management is when somebody tries to change the way people practice language or the way what they believe, try to persuade them to use a different variety or use the same variety. I'll come to that in practice. All that was set out more or less in the first book, Language Policy, published in 2004. And it set out these three areas: language practices, the actual choices made by members of a speech community when communicating, the linguistic repertoire of an individual, or the linguistic repertoire of a speech community. Both of those turn out to be extremely difficult to describe because they vary so much from individual to individual, but at the same time, or in a society, it's very complicated to decide what language is used when, by whom, and so on. Language beliefs, the beliefs about language, its use, and the values of the varieties. How important is a language? And most of those values come either economically, because you get a job if you know this particular language, or identity, heritage. This shows who you are. And that's a set of beliefs. And that leads to a kind of ideology, which can be in the form of my language is more beautiful than anybody else, or French is more logical than any other language, or you must speak correct German or Hebrew or whatever it is. These are beliefs. And then practices, attempts by somebody who is inside a community or part of it or outside it, who believes or claims to have the authority to change the practices or beliefs of others. School teachers are obvious examples. A manager has power, and more recently realized that there are advocates as well. Somebody who wants people to speak in a certain way, but knows that he or she doesn't have power. All this was set out in the later book, which we called Language Management. Managers assume that they have power or authority over its speech community. Stalin decided to change Lenin's policy. Lenin had assumed that the best way to spread communism was to let each of the nations that made up the Soviet Union use its own language. And he encouraged the development of local languages. Stalin, particularly after the Ukrainian wheat harvest failed, blamed nationalism, decided that things have to change, and from then on started pushing the Russian language, as the Tsars had before, and discriminating against the local languages. Or in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew decided when Singapore was established that it was particularly important to straighten out the complex language policy of this very small island state city. And he picked 3 languages, 4 in fact, 4. He said, all the people who are speaking Hokkien or one of the other Chinese dialects should learn Mandarin, or all the Indians should learn Tamil, whatever language they spoke. All the Malays should speak the standard Malay, and everybody should learn English. And in the 30 years that he was Prime Minister, he managed to make enormous changes. Advocates are people like Eliezer Ben Yehuda, who wanted people to speak Hebrew, but didn't expect them necessarily to listen to him. In the same way, a group, an activist group like the Battalion to Spread the Language, who went around Tel Aviv telling people in the street, you must speak Hebrew, because that's the way we're going to build a state. Again, the difference between managers and advocates is not necessarily absolute, but it becomes an important one to look at. What has helped me in this model is that the first time this year, I have come across a paper that validates the model. A young woman in Belgium has written a dissertation and worked with her colleagues in publishing an empirical validation, which shows, in fact, that you can separate, you can distinguish between practices, ideology, and policy. And by doing that, she found that these factors turn out to be independent but related. In a later study, she showed that early childhood professionals who are dealing with multilingual families have those beliefs, those separated beliefs and so on. But that another important thing is what she called perceived self-efficacy, their ability to change things, which essentially is part of the distinction between a manager and an advocate that I mentioned. After publishing the book on language policy, I collected studies in a Cambridge handbook, which gives a wide range and helped me to start learning the complexity of describing what happens in different societies. And then I was ready to start rethinking the model. The first thing that happened in the rethinking was the realization of the importance of levels and domains. This gets published this is published in the new book that's just appeared. Edinburgh University Press is publishing it, and it's called Rethinking Language Policy, and summarizes more or less what I was thinking about, I suppose, a few months ago. We'll come to that in a minute. The first thing was to realize the different levels. There is language policy at each level, within the family, within the neighborhood, in businesses, as well as at the state. Whereas the early people working in the field assumed all they were interested in was the problem of newly independent states in the 1960s. By now, we realize how complex the development and that there is something different at each level, or almost in each domain. Within each domain, ranging from the home to the government, there is a language policy. There's language management, there are language managers. The home domain is very interesting because that's critical in determining essentially what language children are going to be initially presented with. Although it'll change, as you see in a moment. And it could well be that within the family, the differences in individuals bears on outside pressures, internal pressures, the general environment. Most of the studies in language policy look at individuals who've changed their environment. In other words, at immigrants or people who have moved from one country to another for any reason. In the home domain, there are people trying to influence the family. Probably the first important group are the peers, the young kids who come in to play with a child and possibly bring in the community language. The school certainly is trying to persuade the family to change its policy. I remember when we got to Israel, a teacher said to me, "Why don't you speak Hebrew to your children?" And I switched then from Hebrew to English for him, which he couldn't understand very well. And I said, you know, they'll pick up Hebrew. I need to make sure they still know English. The school tries to change the family. The peers change the family. The workplace suggests the kind of jobs you can get with better language knowledge. Religious groups require that you learn a particular language and they'd like it into the home. And government, as we saw mentioned in Singapore, tries to change it as well. The neighborhood, of course, is a very complicated place. And when you come out of the home, you come into an area where there are a lot of languages around, and each of those are going to influence the development of an individual's repertoire. School is a critical point because its first function appears to be not just to keep children off the street, but to develop their knowledge of whatever is chosen as the language and the knowledge required for that community. There's a big problem, which is schools select as language of instruction whatever they think is the important language. And that means that something like 40% of the children in the world go to school and are taught in a language they don't speak at home. The problem is that it takes about 6 or 7, possibly as much as 9 years to gain the level of proficiency that a native speaker of the school language has. And that obviously sets up very major gaps between the people who don't speak and the people who do, which is, of course, why I was so interested early on and did a lot of work on bilingual education. Religion, of course, each religion has its favorite language or its sacred language or its rules about what language are used for the services, what language is used for teaching, what languages are used for preaching. The workplace also sets language policy very seriously. If you're simply digging in the garden, it's not digging in the field, it's probably not terribly important. But in the modern office, or even in the modern factory, knowledge of the language of the workplace is critical. Armies are particularly serious about wanting a language that people understand at different levels. The sergeant's problem is how to give orders to his local group in the French Foreign Legion or in the Israeli army. It's particularly important that people learn the language in which the sergeant is going to give orders. And as one moves up to higher ranks, generals get into more complicated problems because they also have to deal with putting together various armies and so on. In modern states, there are often remnants of regions which vary in language. So that in the United Kingdom, you have the various regions, and each of those major regions, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland in particular, have their own particular original language. This is carried into a territorial language policy in a place like Belgium, where in spite of, or in Switzerland, where each community does its best to stick to its own language and has problems of how to relate. Finally, influencing the development of language policies in the last 50 years or so has been a recognition that human rights include language rights, that linguistic minorities should be able to claim that their language is made available to them, that they have schools that teach them in their own language, that they learn the language of the state, and so on. And all of that comes up against a very simple desire of most nations to have a single official language, to lay down exactly how people should speak and everybody speaking the same language. When you're fortunate enough to have an international language used locally, if it's English, you do very well. If it's French, you used to do a lot better. Arabic is a problem because, in fact, locally people speak different varieties, but centrally, but officially, following the decisions of the Pan-Arabic movement in the 1910-20s, everybody is expected to use standard Arabic. Spanish is widely spread in Latin America. Portuguese is pretty well established in Brazil, so that Brazilian Portuguese has become the standard, and so on. And I talked about Russian. So all of these pressures move into the question of the development and the implementation of a language policy. That's more or less where I was up to a few years ago, and I started thinking seriously about the problem of the failures of policy. My first answer was fairly simple. Language policy established by a state is in trouble if the state doesn't know what's going on at different levels, doesn't recognize that at each of the levels I've talked about, and in each of the domains, there's already a policy. But then I started to realize, as I looked at the countries, that non-linguistic factors, such as civil and international wars and disease and weather and poverty and corruption, interfere very seriously in the implementation of policy. Policy, originally, it was thought that the main reason, the main cause of failure was poor implementation, and the governments were blamed for not knowing how to set up a good policy. But in fact, it turns out to be much more complicated than that. For example, the lack of knowledge of the real situation. One thinks about Thailand, where the assumption was everybody speaks Thai. In fact, it turns out that people in different parts of Thailand speak different kinds of Thai. And in the South, they're likely to be speaking varieties of Malay. And this has led to many problems. And the other problem, of course, for the non-linguistic factors, I'll say a little bit more in a minute or two. Singapore is a good case because it's a comparatively successful case of implementation of language policy by a strong central government, except that there's a problem by the fact that not too many spoke Mandarin to start with. They spoke all the various kinds of Chinese topolecs like Hokkien that make up the Chinese situation. And also the government picked Tamil for all Indians, whatever language they spoke. And English, the government had very serious problems about the development of the variety called Singlish, which is what people in fact speak, rather than the standard Singapore English that the government would like. Obviously, the non-linguistic interferences are critical. We're learning now. I mean, COVID has closed all the schools and is having a major effect on language policy. But corruption in so many states has meant there's no money available for education. Poor state of development, wars, diseases, floods, earthquakes, all of them interfere with the implementation of policy and have to be taken into account in trying to understand what's going on. So in my revised model, I keep the three main ideas: practices, ideology, and management, except the fact that somebody may develop a plan or a policy, but I now add the possibility of non-linguistic interferences and blocks. That was the first major part. And the second major change in the last, my thoughts about language policy has been the recognition of the individual. Now, the basic idea is an individual starts off with a repertoire, a linguistic repertoire, developed in the home, depending on the parents, then goes to school and new languages are added, goes to work, which demands other languages and so on. That model is true, but then the question is the way of getting around it. And it was when I met at a conference in Germany, Jiri Nekrapil and Jiri Nustupny, who talked about management, and it was very exciting to me to have somebody accepting my use of the term management rather than planning. They talked also about self-management, where they were concerned about people working Czechs working in German businesses conducted in Czechoslovakia. And they noticed that individuals would self-manage. That's to say, they would make their own effort to learn the language they thought that would get them further. They didn't wait for the government or the state system to help them. And I was impressed with that. And it was made clearer because I discovered we had a language manager in our family. 3 grandchildren. 2 of them went to school and were learning Hebrew and were starting to speak Hebrew to each other very happily. And the 3rd was growing up and insisted on speaking English, which was the language of his parents. And for a long time, he struggled to keep up his English. He brought friends home from school who knew English, and he told his elder brother and sister he would play with them only in English, which they complained about to their mother. So suddenly I realized the power of the individual affecting the development of language policy. Essentially, the individual may be driven, as in the self-management model, by economic value. I can get a job if I know this language. That's the reason why Korean families are sending their whole family to an English-speaking country while the man stays in Korea and keeps working and making enough money to pay for supporting his family, or why families in New York are paying to have a Mandarin-speaking child carer so that their children will grow up knowing Chinese as well. Or the pull between the importance of the economic value of a language and the importance of an identity value of a language, because the language I speak, as well as getting me a job, tells people who I am. And that becomes one of the two of the most critical forces affecting language policy. So in the rethinking, to summarize where I'm up to, language practices in the environment are the first major force. Group and individual language beliefs and values, the second major force. International, external, and self-management are the third major force. The long linguistic interferences, the floods or the corruption that interfere with education, are the fourth. All of this has a major effect on the expanding repertoire of an individual or of a group. It's complicated, and I expect as I continue to study new cases, I'll be happy to continue to rethink the policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Spolsky. I now invite Sinfree to pose a couple of questions. Sinfree?
Okay. Thank you very much, Bernard. I have two sets of questions. Let me start off with one that is much more relevant to you and your career. In applied linguistics, you've done a lot of work in language policy and in language testing as well. Now, my question to you is, what are the insights that you have gained from language testing, which you think might be of relevance to your rethinking of language policy?
Well, there I get the answer simply from Ilana Shuhami.
Okay.
She pointed out in a book a number of years ago that language tests are the ways to implement language policy. If you can't get into a country without passing a test on language ability, if you can't get into a university without passing a test requiring a certain language, then you're in trouble. In other words, language tests become a method of implementing language policy. Even the people I'm thinking about it. I'll give you an example that we discovered. A few years after our first study, it occurred to us to try and find out what had happened to the immigrants coming to Israel. How well, how quickly are they learning Hebrew? There were sort of some myths around. So we said to the ministry, could we study this? You know, this is many years after the first immigrants had come. We just had a big burst of immigrants arriving from the Soviet Union. we thought it was quite relevant to find out. And we said, we'll do this study on the first year. We'll ask the ministry to give us what data they have about the language ability of immigrants and the language learning of immigrants, and then we'll fill in gaps. We didn't do very well in the first year because the ministry had no information. They would send us to somebody who would say, I'm in charge of the immigrants. And we'd say, what's their language ability like? Said, well, I don't know, because we don't treat them as immigrants. We treat them just like everybody else. We couldn't find any tests that distinguished immigrants from other people until we suddenly discovered that there were some data dealing with the school leaving examination. And we looked at that and we found the ministry's reports. And in the ministry's reports, the immigrants were doing better than the native speakers in the exams in Hebrew and mathematics. And history. And we were quite confused by that. And we looked at it more closely and we thought, oh yes, well, the immigrants don't take the exam. These scores are the ones provided by the teacher. In other words, the system ignored finding out what was going on. When we developed our own tests, we found what people everywhere have discovered, which is that children take, as I mentioned earlier, 6 to 9 years to reach immigrant children take 6 to 9 years to reach the level of native speakers. Now, that obviously is a way that testing has a major effect on policy. The testing that cannot find out what's going on will not tell you where people are up to.
Okay, then the second question before I broaden up my series of questions. What is it that you think language policy might learn from some of the proliferation of models of second language learning that we are currently getting from second language development? If you were to read.
Sorry?
Your view of language policy, being sensitive to discussions about what I mean is, we have this field of second language development or second language acquisition, and it has a lot of these other proliferating models. My question is, what is the relevance of second language models to language policy or to your rethinking of language policy?
What it should be.
What it should be, yes. What it should be, yes. Yeah.
Part of the problem is that it ignores the reality. I mean, when a school system ignores the language that children bring to school and tries to speak to them in another language. I first saw that when we moved to New Mexico and I started working, this is before I started working with the Navajo, but I went out to visit Navajo schools and I walked around a huge school built by the Public Works, where all the children had to be most of the children were in a boarding school situation. And every classroom I came into, the teacher was standing up there teaching in English. He or she didn't know any Navajo. And the children were sitting there not understanding a word. Except finally I came into one classroom where the teacher apologized. He said, I let the children speak to each other in Navajo. And they seemed to be more cheerful. The failure to recognize what's going on is the critical problem. So second language acquisition that now is moving towards recognition of multilingualism, or the translanguaging approach, saying it's all right to mix your languages because that's what people do. That sort of effect of looking at different societies is going to lead, I hope, to better results. But there's not a great deal of evidence showing the success of language teaching approaches. Essentially, what I got almost bored with was the way in which every year somebody would come up with a new method of teaching language. And as long as they keep trying, it's the evidence that we don't know yet how to do it. Well, a lot of things we don't know how to do. We're learning very rapidly how to deal with COVID, for example. And if we're not going to learn, we're in real trouble. The same way, we have to learn much more about how do we teach languages and how do we modify language behaviors.
Oh, okay. Let me just give over to Basi. I'm to some extent skeptical of language policy because I think what it tends to avoid is to deal with the reality that some of the policies may have adverse effects. It seems policy seems to work on an assumption that about the good intentions, that these governments have good intentions, etc. But my suspicion is that some of these policies may have collateral damage on the people that they are intending to serve. And I think any language policy should take into account the unintended adverse effects of a well-intended and designed policy. Yeah.
Yeah, well, obviously, most African countries are still suffering from not just the colonial policy, but the continuation of the colonial notions into the present educational system.
Yes. Okay.
Really completely.
Basi.
Okay, thanks very much, Sinfree. Thanks, Prof. Spolsky. There is a request here from Motap. Let's imagine Sinfree were the president of a country in Africa, and he was so fascinated by this model of yours. What advice would you give him on how to go about implementing your model? What sorts of factors would Sinfree have to take into account in thinking about how to implement a model?
Difficult, because it's complicated. I mean, the first thing, if one thinks what happened in the 60s, when the linguists tried to advise the newly independent countries develop their policies, it became, I suppose it's like trying to persuade people to get inoculated against COVID. People don't, it's so hard to move into an established system, we'll say a school, and come up with teachers who know how to respond to the background of their pupils. I was fortunate enough during the time we were in New Mexico to work with a group of people interested in elementary education who seemed to realize how it was possible to develop an approach that let each individual learn what they wanted and what they needed. But it's very, very difficult when education is underfunded It's very difficult. I've just been looking at the teaching of English in Asia, and the level of success is well below the level desired. And the problem appears to be, in every case, to get adequate teachers, to get enough well-trained people to tackle the task. I think the same sort of thing happens in trying to implement a language policy. If one recognizes that there are beliefs out there that interfere. Ilana Shohami, I remember, complained to me once bitterly. She went into a school in Tel Aviv where most of the pupils were newly arrived from the Soviet Union. And the vice principal was, in fact, a former Soviet citizen and who knew Russian, obviously. And she asked, do you ever put signs up around the school in Russian? Oh, they said, no. We've got to do only Hebrew, nothing else. I mean, this is where translanguaging and the philosophy that goes with it is starting to break things down. The Tsars say, recognize the fact that people mix languages. Get teachers who can live with that situation.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll take two questions. One from Suzanne, inviting a link between Larissa Aronin's idea of the dominant language constellations and the individual linguistic repertoires you referred to earlier on. And another question from Rajan on translanguaging. So Susan wants to know what you think about Larissa's dominant language constellations as a productive way of capturing the idea that individuals manage the groups of languages in their repertoires for different domains. Then Rajan wonders okay, sure.
Yeah, I was impressed when I first read it. I'm a little uncomfortable that it oversimplifies, that it says, look at the major languages, forget about everybody else. Take the three biggest cases, or if you like, and forget about the complexity of the repertoire. If one looks at what happens in the natural translanguaging in many schools in England, the work that Rampton and so on did, where you discovered children from one country starting to pick, and just as a game, to speak one of the other languages around, rather than being able to pick the major languages around. So that to me, if it works as a quicker method of training teachers and of training teachers to accept multilingualism, then it's a good idea. But if it oversimplifies, it's going to be, I think, a difficulty.
Okay. All right. Still on a related theme, Rajan wonders how you see translanguaging practices on future language policies. how do you envisage the impact of growing translanguaging practices on future language policies? And what do you see as the very future of named languages as we know them today?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. Yes, it's true that language repertoires include a lot to them. Translanguaging may be oversimplifying as well. But it's an important advance, I think, over the acceptance of multilingualism is the important advance. The recognition that each language has its own values within its own community and so on. So that it's moving ahead, but making up a new word like that, I'm not sure how necessary it was enough to talk about multilingualism and language. I would like to see more development of language repertoires. I would like to see grammars that allow for the complexity of language repertoires rather than the basic grammars only on single named languages.
Okay. There's a terminological question here around the use of policy and the use of practice, a concern that what would ordinarily be the distinction between policy and practice is perhaps being conflated in the account of your model. So if everyone can make a language policy, including parents speaking to their children, what then is the precise boundary between policy and individuals' practices? Wouldn't it be much more appropriate to use the term policy only for public policy as made by governments in the same way as political scientists and others do?
I don't think so, because what I'm arguing is that at each level there are going to be the practices, and those practices tell you what people actually do. That's what I mean. Whether they say that's what you should do or not. There are clear cases of management where somebody says, no, we want you all to speak this language. We want you to, at meals, speak only Hebrew. I think of a wonderful case I was told about once, a patriarch from Morocco who, when they lived in Morocco, and his family lived there, insisted that on Friday night, everybody speak Hebrew. When they came to Israel, he insisted on Friday night, everybody speak Judeo-Arabic, because he was concerned with maintaining, in each case, the weaker language. That was making a policy within the family, right? But in fact, practices are the result of all those policies that work or don't work, of all those mixtures of the person who comes in, who wants to go use one language rather than another, or has learnt one word rather than another, or the peers who come in and so on. It's confusing, I know. The word policy is difficult, but I would simply say policies appear at each of the levels. There are firms in which you only get a job if you know a certain language. There are requirements in hospitals that doctors and nurses don't use a language to speak to each other that the patients don't understand, and so on. So at each level, there was a policy, and at each level, there were practices.
Okay. Almost in some oblique agreement with the answer you've given, Stephen underscores the need to look at individuals' right to management advocacy, especially in contexts where there are so many conflicting discourses. And the backdrop to this is that Stephen has been working.
Sound like you're not going. Yes.
So there's some. Okay, so Stephen's backdrop, the backdrop to Stephen's comment is that Stephen has been working on the notion of received language policy. And Stephen is using this to investigate the management or advocacy voices that are strongest in influencing the self-management decisions of individuals in Northern Catalonia. So in a sense, we find Stephen making use of some of your concepts already in their doctoral research. So I guess that's another.
I'd be like to hear the results of the study, just as that recent study from Belgium gives me a chance to learn more.
Yes.
That's why I talk about rethinking. I expect to keep thinking.
Yeah, then there's a question from Stephanie. She says, you did make reference to Czech linguists working within the framework of language management theory, which harks back to work by Janud and Stopny. And she wonders how useful you find this specific theory based on stages for the analysis of language politics.
I learned a lot from them. I think they looked at particular examples from industry, which are, I think, very useful. There aren't enough studies of the workplace and how language policy develops there. And particularly, they finally persuaded me that the individual is important. And that's what I mainly appreciate from them.
Okay. Then Penny would like you to elaborate a bit more on the non-linguistic interferences, since this is rather new in your model. Penny goes on to say, wars could potentially have huge impacts, but perhaps pandemics as well.
Yes, yeah. I found that in particular when I was sort of looking through examples of policies developing, and it became so almost commonplace that towards the end one would say, oh, but we had a war and we had no money for school, or the schools were closed, or all the money from the oil actually goes to private hands and there's no money to run education, or the floods have closed all the schools, or the pandemic has closed all the schools. We can't, I'm afraid, ignore the world in which we live, which is full of non-linguistic interference all the time.
Okay, I see Carsten Leger has his hands up. Let me take a question from him and then we'll continue with questions posted in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Bernard, I'm glad to see your face, and I would like to refer to your slide number 9, where you speak about basics. And you say that ISO, International Standard Organization, decides what the language is. You know, I have been the Swedish coordinator for a project dealt with all languages in Tanzania. And according to Ethnologue, there were 120 languages, but we got 150 languages because we should accept people identifying themselves speaking a particular language. I did research on a language which was very close to the next one, almost 100% mutually intelligible. But there's this dialect continuum close to the East African Tanzanian coast. And we should accept that people have the right to use a sort of self-identification, linguistic self-identification without ISO, you know? Or I'm working now on Namibia again, back to the roots, editing manuscripts. And we have the same. When I joined the University of Namibia in 1994, I became a member of a curriculum committee where they implemented language policy issues in school, you know. And there was a group of language or dialects, which is covered by the linguistic term Oshiwambo or Wambo. It's an Ambo dialect continuum. So they decided that now the major languages want to separate, want to have their own programs and their own curricula in school. So it was just accepted. So it is really not okay when we accept ISO to be the ultimate power to say what a language is and not. I mean, we know as linguists we have the criteria to make a difference between a dialect and a language, which is meaning something is not mutually intelligible. And the second one is, the second remark, sorry, is you speak about language ideologies. So where is now the word language politics? Okay, that's all.
Good, good. Well, language politics is getting my language recognized by somebody, whether it's ISO or my government or a linguist or two. When one looks closely at what goes on, my favorite case was when I actually persuaded Ethnologue to drop a language. I was going through the references to Yiddish, and suddenly I discovered in Ethnologue a reference to Yiddish sign language. And this felt very uncomfortable because, as was confirmed when I spoke to sign language experts, you don't talk about sign languages as related to language, you talk about where they're used. So that you would have British or American or French or Israeli or so on sign languages, rather than English or French or German or whatever. So I wondered about the Yiddish case, and I wrote to them, and they said, we'll look up how we got it. And they said it was actually sent to them by a distinguished psychologist. He didn't send it to them. He had actually written in the introduction to a book that there were different languages, such as Yiddish Sign Language. Unfortunately, he wasn't still alive when my inquiry got there, and his assistant said, well, we don't know where he got that from. So essentially, I persuaded Ethnologue, who are the ISO people now, to drop it. And then when I kept thinking about it, I wondered, maybe there is a case. There were schools for deaf in Eastern Europe before the war. And in some of those schools, it may be that the speakers were speakers of Yiddish, and it may be they developed their own sign languages, just as in some of the Bedouin villages in Israel, they've developed their own sign languages. We don't have any evidence for that. But to define what is or isn't to be a named language, well, it's language politics, I should say. And if a group is strong enough, there's still big arguments going on about Kosovo, and I understand. There will always be arguments about naming a variety. There are linguists claiming that modern Hebrew should have a different name, should be called Israeli, because it's not the language that developed out of the Bible and so on. That's language politics, I would say.
Okay, there's a question from Magda. We have so many questions. I'm afraid I may not be able to take them all, but I'll try. Magda has a question around self-management. Isn't self-management a combination of your earlier model comprising practice, belief, and management, but situated at the individual level? How about the non-linguistic features influencing self-management?
Like, can you afford to go to a school, to a private school to learn a language? That would be a non-linguistic influence on the implementation of a policy. I could decide I would like to learn Arabic, and well, nowadays the best place to learn Arabic, it used to be until quite recently, Jordan. Jordan is a bit unsafe at the moment, and Jordan anyway wouldn't take me as a student. That's a non-linguistic influence on a situation. Self-management is also up against problems of implementation.
Okay, then Sangeeta is concerned about a risk of determinism in the new model, to the extent that the new model speaks of children's home language in the singular rather than in the plural.
Oh, it should be plural.
And she wonders if the new model has a risk or is associated with a monolingual bias. For instance, you discuss people's or children's native language and home language in the singular.
Ah, okay. I shouldn't.
Okay. All
Sorry.
right.
It's the same reason. But this is where I've also recognized another difficulty. I don't like named languages, but I don't know how to talk about linguistics without naming languages. In other words, I can't talk about translanguaging without naming the languages that make up the group that are used in the repertoire. That's part of the problem of what we're dealing with. We don't quite know how to handle it. Quantum theory might be useful.
Okay, there's a comment and a question from Katie, which harks back to Sinfri Makuni's earlier question. It's about the relevance or the impact of models of second language acquisition research on language policy. Kati poses the following question. How would you characterize the relation between language science and language policy? For example, most research on translanguaging has adopted a post-structural and or sociocultural approach to second language acquisition. To me, it seems this approach attempts to change ideology without providing the empirical evidence that might persuade language managers. Question, can language science sway policy, or is ideology too entrenched for that to happen?
Good question. Ideology is well entrenched. Beliefs, unfortunately, are very hard to influence. I think of our own work here when we came up with the proposed language policy for the ministry. Now, two particularly interesting things struck us. We were to meet with the minister to make a presentation of our policy suggestions, which were that Israel has to have a language education policy that recognizes multilingualism, that recognizes the importance of the national language, Hebrew, of the largest minority language, Arabic, of the economically important global language, English, and so on. And then all the other languages that had to be involved. And we came up with a way of expressing that. Now, that meeting that was to take place with the minister, while we were waiting for the minister to arrive, we were sitting around with senior people from the ministry, and they said, oh, we'll tell the minister we just got a telegram from the French ambassador to Israel. He happens to be in Paris at the moment, but he heard about this meeting, and he wanted to remind the minister that the teaching of Hebrew in France depends on the maintenance of the teaching of French in Israel. That's language politics, if you like. Now, the point about it is that there were all these things we didn't think about. The reason our policy was not effective is that we started from the top. We didn't get through to the individual teachers who were going to have to implement it. We persuaded the minister, but he didn't manage to persuade any of his nearby assistants to do anything about it. And it took a long time, and now slowly people within the system are starting to change things. Ilana Shohami is doing very important work, running classes for school principals, which is obviously an excellent level at which to try and affect policy. So that theoretical policy is very hard to implement, except that.
Okay, just before I invite Sally Coco, there's a question from Robin. Robin wonders what you mean when you refer to the grammar, a grammar of a repertoire. Are you thinking of a description of practice or of a mental representation?
Yes. Whatever a grammar is, I would like to see a way of handling the fact that there is variation with sociolinguistic relevance within every language system. there's changes in the way in which I speak to my wife or to my children or to their new baby. This kind of variation I would like to see grammars try to tackle. And so far they haven't.
Okay. Sally?
Yeah, thank you very much for the way in which you articulate the distinction between language policy, language management, and language practices. And I like the idea of language management very much because it reminds me of economics as management of resources. On the other hand, when I think of the different levels of policies, which I think is quite accurate, it conjures up the possibility of a clash between the policies at the different levels, especially between the government, the family, and the individuals. Any thought about how to handle such clashes?
Yeah, that worries me very much. And I think particularly of the work of Joseph LoBianco. He, a few years, had, sorry, let me, oh dear. Stop it. Okay. Doing that. Sorry. Joseph LoBianco has been doing very interesting work recently in a number of countries of organizing very complex, large group meetings to talk about the development of language policy where there are a great number of different interests. He's working in places like Myanmar and in, I think, New Guinea as well, and so on, where there are very complex situations. I want to learn a lot more about how he does it. I know that he does it, but I don't think he's described it in any detail yet. But it recognizes exactly what you're talking about. The fact that there are different interests involved in language policy, and the people involved need to get together and work out consensuses on how to deal with it.
Okay, thank you. We'd like to thank everyone for participating in the formal part of the forum. So this first formal part is typically recorded and moderated. We are now moving on to the informal part, which is akin to you having a drink at the conference venue. So this part is not moderated, but digital caviar may be passed around. So please, let's keep the conversation going, but we would like to stop recording at this point. Please